Greetings. My name is Guy Dauncey, and this is a show called Change the World, where if you're a regular viewer, you'll know that I like to invite guests on who share my, how do we put it, my vision for a beautiful planet, my commitment to solutions where we don't bother with whining and moaning and groaning. We're looking for how do we solve our many problems. Today, my guest is Erik Pikkila, a forester, ecological forester. Forester in training with 33 years experience in the forest and 3 generations of forestry behind you, Erik. A BC forester in training, ecoforestry experience in British Columbia, Finland, the US North Pacific, the Sierra Nevada, the Redwoods, trained by the world-renowned ecoforester Jerry Franklin, and you work with 10 major forest companies.
Well, I looked after them, yes.
Yeah, so before we plunge into what is ecoforestry, what is the problem in the forest today?
I'd say that the forests are suffering from probably 100 years of a lot of cutting, a lot of harvesting, and changing the landscape from old growth, 100% old growth, to less than 10% old growth.
Would it be fair to say that generically, I like to think that one of our problems as humans, we're massively ignorant ecologically. We just don't understand ecology. Like it was never taught in universities until recently that a lot of our forestry simply comes from not understanding the forest. You just cut it down, ship it off.
Well, there's a conflict that actually goes way back to early 1900s at Yale University, where it's still, even from far back then, it's still the same issues today, utilization versus conservation. So back then there was a guy named Bernard Fernau, who was teaching utilization, came from Europe, and on his counterpoint was Gifford Pinchot, who was the first U.S. forester, but also chief forester, but also he was about conservation. And that is still the classic conflict we have between complete utilization or very near complete utilization and conservation, and the conflict that exists because of this.
I've seen I came out to British Columbia, coming up 30 years ago. I've seen the massive clear cuts that used to exist in the 1980s, early 90s, just even on a steep hillside, just strip it all down. And then the soil erosion, the rainfall. Robert Bateman, the artist, he gave a talk once, and he said in Switzerland, where his family came from, I think, they banned clear cutting as early as the 13th century on hillsides because they saw what happened with the soil loss.
Right, and Norway and Sweden 100 years ago, they used to do exactly what we're doing now in BC. They were clear cutting and exporting raw logs, and 100 years ago, they stopped doing that. So today they have 5 times more forest than they had then. They're fully forested. They have a full manufacturing industry, and they're producing more jobs per cubic meter than we are now in BC. And Norway and Sweden and Finland start where BC ends, at the 60th parallel north. Yeah. So we are in a much more temperate climate and greater growing conditions, so we should be outstripping them in tree growth and volume and products that we can make and jobs per cubic meter, but we're not doing that.
It's frustrating that we go to IKEA to buy all our furniture made from Swedish, Scandinavian timber, and our timber gets shipped off to China as almost what we call matchsticks, it is frustrating.
Right, and also if we, here on the coast, if we let Douglas fir stands grow from age 60 to age 100, there'd even be more wood for the companies to do things with and to make products and get more jobs, because the stand volume, the volume per cubic meters per hectare, it doubles from age 60 to age 100. So if the margins are tight now for the forest companies, imagine what they could do with double the volume of their wood if you let it grow to age 60 and age 100.
So if you imagine a scale with complete utilization, an absolute clear cutting at one end, a complete conservation, which doesn't mean never cutting a tree, but managing the forest for conservation purposes, where on that spectrum is the mainstream forestry in BC happening? Is it in the middle? Is it to one extreme?
I'd say, well, it's closer to 100% utilization, and that's a system that we've done for a long, long time. We've dabbled in things called ecosystem-based management. In the 1990s and early 2000s, we had the BC Forest Practices Code, which involved making sure, and that's what I looked after those 30 forest companies, is making sure that they were retaining wildlife tree patches, riparian reserves, other landscape level reserves, that were making sure important bits and pieces, the biological legacies that would happen, that would pass from one forest to the next after a forest fire or Mount St. Helens and those types of things, and making sure that those are the important pieces are going forward into the next forest. And we were doing it then, and in the United States too, they're still doing it somewhat under the Northwest Forest Plan for the spotted owl.
So what's happened to the Forest Practices Code? Has we gone forward or backwards from then?
We've gone back to clear cutting and we've gone backwards. We've backed away from ecosystem or ecological-based forestry.
Why?
Because politics, right? Because the different political parties have come in, and same thing in the United States, same thing here in BC, is where we backed away from doing ecological forestry or ecosystem-based management, and we've gone back to clear cutting, which is for a complete utilization purposes, that's the best system going, because you move in, get the wood, and get out, and keep on going.
So
but
is it really politics, or is there something behind the politics that's very much all raw?
Well, it basically is that they wanted to get out of the way of companies and let them manage themselves and report to the government saying that they're looking after the forest and replanting it, which they do all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But replanting on its own doesn't just make a forest, because those important biological legacies are not being passed on to the next forest. Large, big trees that are alive, large dead trees, large downed logs. And ecological processes that we can't even see under the soil.
You know, my sister in England belongs to a evangelical church which runs companies. And one of the companies they run is a local timber company, right? And they're building, rather. And she told me that until, say, the 1970s, the timber from Canada was hard-grained, really quality, and then it began to shift and it would warp more easily and it was thinner grain, it wasn't worth so much. Was that when we moved from the old growth timber to the new stuff that shoots up really quickly?
Basically, we in and about the 70s, but probably more 80s and into the 90s. But in the 80s, there was a whole section of forest operations that shut down because they ran out of old growth. They were into the farthest and farthest reaches, and then they went to other operations where they're doing old growth, like the west coast of the island or up coast. So that's exactly what happened. And those kind of tight growth rings, that quality, takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to develop.
And if you have a clear cut, trees all shoot up really quickly.
Right.
And they're more rapid growth, so they're thinner growth rings, right?
Well,
they're thicker, they're growing faster.
And also they're growing fast, but also too, we don't give them the time. Like eventually, if you get time, you will get those tight growth rings as growth slows down. Yes. But that's hundreds and hundreds of years in development, and we don't give them that time. Like structurally, second growth, the Douglas fir is about 80% of the structural qualities of old growth Douglas fir, but from that, because it's young wood and it's sapwood and wide growth rings, then that's why you get that warping capability, or that warping action.
So let's do the shift and move from the problems to the solutions. So you've given me some slides and images. Yes. And if you can bring the first photo up and you can talk to it, then we'll run through the photos and then we'll have some more discussion. So explain what's happening here.
So this is an older forest, not old growth. This is, I believe, down at Royal Roads in Victoria. Yeah. And you can actually see a nature kindergarten right in front there. Right. So, but what I want to show in this picture is that you've got multiple tops of trees. You've got the big Douglas fir on top. You've got some cedars coming up. Yes. You have multiple heights, multiple ages. You can also see that a few of them have dead tops. There's some dead gray tops on them as well. So there's various decay processes happening there, and natural processes occurring. There'll be lichens in the trees, but in particular, multiple ages, multiple heights, and decay processes and old age impacts, and that's what a complete forest has. It has all these kind of different structural elements, as they call them.
So the next image looks to me like a bomb has gone through it.
So this is a cedar tree then that has been burnt out, but in our temperate rainforests from basically Alaska to California, fire is an important feature. For us here in the coastal Douglas fir zone, we live in a fire ecosystem here, and even on the west coast of the island and all the way up and down the coast, a fire could rip through once in 1,000 years perhaps.
Somewhere in British Columbia, they're ripping through right now.
They're ripping through right now, and from an ecological standpoint, fire is an important thing with the lodgepole pine in the interior. Fires would be getting rid of the mountain pine beetles. They also, the lodgepole pine needs the fires to open up the cones to let the seeds out. So fires are important parts of the ecosystem. Yeah. And in places like California, right after a fire where there's a whole new sea of dead trees, which we call snags, specific woodpecker species are moving in and utilizing them and colonizing them right after a fire. So there's even right after a fire, and there's huge impacts on the new development of habitat.
hugely difficult message for those of us on east of Vancouver Island to take, because we live in the forest and we're scared of fire, right?
Right, but the thing is that we can fireproof our places and do maybe some thinning that will maybe minimize the risk, and you don't want to have a whole sea of slash lying on the ground.
So the next image, it's a nurse log. I learned this term when I first arrived here. What is a nurse log?
So nurse logs are part of these biological legacies that from one ecosystem to the next, that this down log used to be a live tree and then a dead standing tree, and now has fallen down. So it's decaying, it's becoming part of the soil, but in that meantime, it is also a raised seed bed. Right. So that's why I think that's a hemlock in that picture there, that it has landed on there and germinated and putting its roots around that tree and into the soil.
This hemlock is really feeding on its mother's breast in that sense. It's taking the nutrients from the rotting tree.
Yeah, and also too, it's a raised microsite, like in particular on the west coast where you have 20-foot walls of salmonberry and salal. These raised logs will let seedlings start germinating, whereas if you didn't have those raised microsites, then the seeds don't have that possibility to germinate.
So they're getting more light because they're slightly raised up?
Right, and they're not being overtopped and shaded out by the salmonberry and by the salal.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
So
and
the next
upturned roots will do that for you too.
The next image is of a great snowy mountain.
Right. So Mount St. Helens, 1980, May 18th, was a huge watershed for ecological. Right, the volcano, but nobody has actually connected that a volcano would have anything to do with ecology or would have anything to do with ecological forest management or forest management in particular. But Jerry Franklin and many, many other researchers were within hours and within days out on Mount St. Helens, and they thought, well, this is crazy that it's completely destroyed. Yes. It's going to have to regenerate, repair itself from the outside in because there's nothing left here. Right. But then what they found is tons and tons of biological legacies. So there was dead standing trees, millions and millions downed logs. Yes. There was seedlings that had been protected, insulated by snow drifts. Right. You had seeds that were under the soil covered over by ash, and then within hours, then you had the mold starting to turn the soil and bringing the ash and mixing the ash into the soil and getting those seeds starting to germinate.
The mold meaning the funguses and the bacteria?
No, moles, as in voles. Oh. Right, so
little animals.
Little animals. So they were going through and turning the soil and mixing the ash with the topsoil and getting that the seeds weren't so far down; they were coming closer to the surface.
Wow.
So actually, Mount St. Helens started to revegetate itself from the inside out.
There you go.
But that's what the important where we learned biological legacies of what is from one ecosystem handed to the next.
So now we're seeing a really old tree with some fungus on it. What's the importance of this?
So fungi it turns out, are the keystone species in our temperate ecosystems, and probably in many ecosystems, perhaps in the Amazon as well. In some places it may be a crab, it may be something else that is the keystone species that lets those ecosystems function. And here, fungi are the keystone species that are linking and turning, changing live matter into dead matter and further decaying it, making it become soil, creating habitat opportunities, softening a dead tree for a woodpecker to come in and tap, and those types of things. So there's an example of a fungi, and then in the next picture.
Next one coming up. An exploded tree.
Right, so there's two of these at Wildwood, and they were both caused by a fungus called velvet top fungus. Yes. Were a huge, and you can see that's about 25 feet where the explosion is, and the next one over, the first one is about...
The tree's just all blown itself
apart.
It
literally exploded, right? It may have been wind, may not, but the gravity took over and mechanics, and 5 to 10 centimeters of live wood on the outside, and the other 98% is completely just crumbly rot on the inside.
The fungus.
Right. So it is a prime mover in that ecosystem, and as we know from a lady named Suzanne Simard, a researcher at UBC, is that the fungi are also connecting all the trees and the plants together so they can share moisture, they can share nutrients, and hugely important in connecting, again, the ecosystem. She calls it the wood wide web under the soil.
The wood wide web. Okay, so now we have, it looks like you tell me, it's a wetlandy...
It's a wetland.
It is a wetland, yes.
Yes, this is a wetland out in Yellow Point, where we've toured around, but also to enforce, it's not only the importance of trees and down logs and those types of things, but without a forest, you don't have water, you don't have clouds, you don't have any of those types of things. So what I like to say is without green, you don't have the blue, And in particular, in forests, we have lots of wetlands. And wetlands, they store water, they filter water, and will help keep it there for a while, and then hopefully it'll eventually percolate down and recharge the aquifers.
Because without the forest, the rain's going to come straight down and basically run straight off.
Right.
Whereas with the forest, it's being modulated and permeated down through the branches and gradually, and then it can sit and take time, right?
Right, and also snow, if there's in a snow situation too, the big branches and all the needles, 60 million needles, will stop the snow and let it drip slowly down to the ground, as opposed to a rush and freshet type thing.
Right. So now we have two elderly gentlemen, my kind of age.
Yes. So the guy on the left is Jerry Franklin.
Oh, right.
And the guy on the right is my friend Marshall, who's a retired forester from the U.S. Forest Service. So this was actually a celebration for Jerry's 50, 60 years in the business back in 2012. Yeah. But I just wanted to show what Jerry Franklin looks like, and my friend Marshall, who's been supporting me in all kinds of different projects too, but they actually went to Oregon State University together in the same class back in 1959.
So in a minute we'll get onto ecoforestry, which is what he's all about.
But Jerry Franklin he's one of the grandfather and the father of ecosystem-based management, ecoforestry, and as I can show with his brand spanking new book from February this year.
Ecological Forest Management.
Ecological Forest Management, brand spanking new.
There you go. The Bible of how to do it, right?
Well, the current Bible, and there's several other ones too. Yeah.
And so then we have just a couple more slides. That looks like a forest and some clear-cut mix.
Right. So up on the very top of the hill slope there's a clear-cut, and down below is what I would call ecosystem-based management in the form what's called variable retention harvesting. So you can see some trees in that little harvest unit to the right there, where trees were actually retained on the site. Very few, but still more than a clear cut.
Yeah. And then is this the same system?
The same system again, variable retention harvesting, more trees retained here, and this is actually on Pack Forest near Mount Rainier, which is the University of Washington's forest. So again, showing that there's different ways to do it, and this is all based on the Mount St. Helens and Jerry Franklin's work.
And then finally, we have someone cutting a tree.
Right, so this is Peter Jungwirth, who's our co-chair at Wildwood, and also a professional forester and an arborist, and climbs and did the eco-harvest last September at Wildwood. So we would spend sometimes 20 minutes, half an hour discussing which trees to cut or not to cut, and why not to cut, and what we wanted to retain, and not just sort of a well, let's just go cut it all type of thing. We sat down and wrestled with what are we trying to do here? Create more light for Douglas fir, or leave it a little bit tighter because it's a cedar thing?
So now I want to ask, what is Wildwood? I know that Merv Wilkinson managed it, and he's not practicing variable retention at all. It's a different thing. So ecoforestry is different from variable retention.
Right, from ecosystem-based management and different from clear-cut forestry. So.
And I personally, a lot of my neighbors, we have little, forest around us.
Right.
If someone watching this show wants to manage their forest using ecoforestry methods, what are the key things they need to think about before they get the chainsaw out?
Right. So basically, the first thing is that probably need to put economics out of the picture completely. Because you're doing ecoforestry, you're doing it for completely other reasons. You're cutting for ecological purposes.
Well, let me jump in there, because I remember Merv had his forest for 80 years or so, he was logging. Right. And he never clear cut it.
No.
But he did an inventory of the timber before, and then he did it after 60, 80 years. Right. And he had more timber standing at the end, but he'd taken out the full volume as if he had clear cut. So he's still got income. Right. But he got it spread over 60 years and not all at once. Right. So he got income from the forest, though.
Yeah, he got about a third of his income from the forest.
Yes.
And what he did is he came in and he said he was only cutting the amount that was growing every year, that he was tapping into that. So he was just touching the interest, not the principal.
I just wanted to counteract a little bit, or give pushback. You're saying, don't think about money at all, but think about long-term income and not short-term income. Is that better?
Right. But also too, the actual decision of whether to cut a tree or not to, or keep a tree, is not based on economics.
Right. So that was your first principle. What's the second principle to think about?
Well, the second principle thinking is to know your ecosystems, because at Wildwood there's a Douglas fir ecosystem in quite a large area, and there's also cedar. Yes. So Douglas fir needs lots of light, and Merv also too did natural regeneration, so he didn't plant any trees. Right. And Douglas fir needs at least 50% of the sunlight reaching the forest floor in order for the seeds to germinate naturally.
When I go through a lot of second growth forest, it's really thick. There's almost no sunlight coming as the trees are shot up. Yeah. So that's different from what you're saying then. You need to let the light in.
Well, and they did have the light in when they were first, because that stand that you were walking through, well, that was a clear cut to begin with, or it was wide open. So then the trees were able to germinate.
But in a big old forest, you're going to have some trees are going to fall, which naturally would let the light in, right?
Right, but it still may not be enough because it's individual trees, single tree openings, as a tree falls over, like now those exploded trees, well, it's made a little bit of a hole, a gap in the canopy, but it hasn't made maybe a big enough of a hole because Douglas fir needs lots of light.
So are you choosing the trees that you want to fell in 50 years and then getting the light to clear around them by taking out some of the competing trees?
Right, and there's a good example at Wildwood where there's a nice stand. You can see he's taken about maybe 10, 12 trees around, and we've left some big, tall Douglas fir on top. And then we've, in the intervening 30 years, then there's some nice Douglas fir seedlings that are, well, now saplings that have come up because enough light was opened up in that stand.
Now, does cedar follow the same principle as Douglas fir?
No, cedar is different because, that's a good question, because Douglas fir is shade intolerant. Will not grow in its shade or any other tree's shade.
Okay.
Right?
That's why they're all skinny below and they're pushing right up.
Right, because they have their tops up on top because they're looking for the light.
Cedars, they have branches all the way up.
They have and that earlier picture that showed us, there was a lot of cedar in that picture and basically canopy or the green part of the tree right down to the ground. So cedar then and other trees like hemlock will grow in their shade, other trees' shade and their own shade. They're called shade tolerant.
Okay, so how do you manage for a cedar forest?
So a cedar forest then, and there's a good example of that at Wildwood too, is that cedar forest is managed differently. It can actually be, more trees can be left and more shade left because the cedar and the hemlock will grow just fine in the shade.
I've often noticed cedars going in groves all together. So they're giving each other shade together then, right?
Right, and they also maybe they're just, they could be also not exactly clones, but anyway, that they're just sort of almost coming out from a mother tree in some cases too. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So they will grow in the shade, and on the west coast is like that too, and Sitka spruce is somewhat like that too, that they can grow in their own shade, whereas Douglas fir doesn't. So from an ecoforestry standpoint, we're going to leave a cedar forest with more trees in it, more shade, than we would a Douglas fir forest.
So what is an ecoforestry covenant? I've heard about this phrase, that you can actually covenant your land so that when I die or you die, your forest will always be managed in ecoforestry method. How does an ecoforestry covenant work?
Right, so there's one in the works for Wildwood. There's a trust in there now that lays out a whole bunch of strict regimes that says what we're going to do and not do with the property.
Right.
But covenants too are maybe not as strict, let's say, but still very important tools that people can put on their land, and that you could come in and do ecoforestry in there and do it harvest in a sustainable manner, because that's the entire intention with this, to do that, is to
But it would mean that a future owner of the forest would continue.
Right, because the covenant then goes with the deed and the title of the property, but then with the development of systems, and they have this in Finland where you have local forestry associations that help small landowners, help them with replanting and planning and road building and those types of things. It's a thing that they have in Europe in spades. They have small forest associations that helps private landowners. But here in BC and in Western Canada, in US and that type of stuff, we don't have anything like that at all. And that's probably something we should be developing.
So if a whole bunch of landowners who lived close to each other in the coastal Douglas fir forest on Vancouver Island got together, did this sort of thing, put covenants on, is it fair to say that over the next 150 years, their forest would recover old growth characteristics?
Right, that if there's ways to do cutting and make sure that you're retaining, that there's logs on the ground and there's dead standing trees, that you're making sure that those biological legacies are being passed forward. So the more biological legacies there and the hidden ecological processes we can't even see, as long as we have those going and they can recover, or we have a little spot where they can branch out from, then you're going to move your way sooner. You're going to cut down on that trajectory curve in order that you get to an old growth condition sooner than later, right?
Wow.
And time is of importance no matter what, but by helping along and letting those important biological legacies be there, because you're collecting time, you're actually banking time by making sure you've got some of those older representative pieces of the older forest and pass that on to future forests.
So Wildwood will be using Ecoforestry Covenant, but I gather from a colleague called Barry Gates that down in Shawnigan, there's forest that's also got these ecological covenants covenants on them.
Right, and they did that at a place called Elkington Forest.
Yes.
So they've done some development, but there's still a large retention of the area that's designated as park and ecological.
Very large area. South of Shawnigan Lake.
South of Shawnigan Lake, up in the sort of the foothills of the Malahat. But there's possibility they're trying to build it there. They're trying to make sure that you have some development, smart development, and you're making sure that there is forests that are still being retained in larger patches, because that's actually what we need. We actually need bigger patches.
So we just got 2 minutes to wrap up in. Are there any other thoughts you'd like to leave our viewers with?
I would suggest with climate change that I think we're probably in a pretty good place because we have Douglas fir, and Douglas fir is used to summer droughts. And with the climate change that's coming, they are already adapted to that, but hopefully the climate change that is coming isn't going to overwhelm them. But the trees are have 10,000 years of innate ability and growth patterns and that kind of stuff that I think they're going to be able to withstand these changes that are coming, but we need to help them along.
And of course, in the meantime, they're storing carbon.
They're storing carbon,
They're keeping the local ecosystem cooler.
Cooler and providing shade.
They're providing a home for all the owls and the wolves and the cougars and the creatures, right?
And moisture.
Moisture for the watersheds.
Yeah,
they're
and
protecting the watersheds.
Yeah, and slowing down the water.
And they're creating beauty in the landscape.
And creating beauty and chances for people to get out in nature and do some of that sort of forest bathing and
deeply absorbed in the forest, the peace that comes
their
with it.
health.
So what's not to like about hanging on to our forest?
Clean air, clean water, and habitat, and all kinds of medicinal properties that we don't even know in forests yet that can help us look after ourselves if we can help look after the forest.
Well, look, this has been great, Erik. Thanks so much for this quick, I feel like I've been through a quick university course in how to do ecoforestry, right? So thank you for your leadership in all this, right?
Thank you, Guy.
This has been the show Change the World. My name's Guy Dauncey. One of the little contributions I have to making a better world is this novel that I wrote called Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible, set in Vancouver in the year 2032. You can find about it at the website journeytothefuture.ca. If you enjoy this kind of discussion, tune in next week for more scintillating, positive, visionary discussion. Thanks for watching.